it's Mo. It is Novella November, and a few days ago I made a video about my favorite novellas from prior to starting Booktube. Go check that video out. In that video you can also see 3 of my favorite short nonfiction books because it's also Nonfiction November. If you're unfamiliar with Novella November, it's a time of year where we read novellas and we celebrate the short novel form. In my mind, a novella is a book under 175 pages, and a short novel is a book from 175 pages to 250 pages. I also made a video about short novels during Shorty September, so I will have that video linked down below. November is also a great time to catch up on your number reading goal. If you created a number reading goal for the beginning of the year and you're falling behind, or maybe you're wanting to hit that goal, or maybe you want to surpass it and see how many books you can read this year, Novella November is a great time to read a bunch of short books. I divided my favorite novellas into my favorite novellas pre-Booktube, which you can see in the other video, and today we're going to talk about my favorite novellas from since I started Booktube to 2022. And my favorite novellas that I've read so far in 2022. On to the books that I have read since starting Booktube. The first, and maybe one of my favorites, is Passing by Nella Larson. Nella Larson was a writer during the Harlem Renaissance. This is a story about 2 friends growing up in a small town. They're both black, but they can both pass for white. They break apart as teenagers and then come back together when they are both living in Manhattan in the 1920s. They have lived extremely different lives. They have extremely different views on their blackness and their society and culture. This story is about how they reconnect and the drama and troubles that ensue from that reconnection. This story is about colorism and about how society, even a society like New York that thought itself very cosmopolitan, very open to things, treated black women at the time. And this is also a story that's extremely hard to read. There's lots of racism in this, and that does play a major role in this story, of course, but it's definitely worth reading. It also has just a super fast-paced, compelling vibe. A book that I read right at the beginning of my YouTube career and was one of my favorite books of 2020 was The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. My husband had read this one and he really liked it. I had this weird feeling before I read it that it was some very hard to read classic, something about war or difficult subject matter, and there is some difficult subject matter in this, and definitely for all the books that I'm talking about you should look up trigger warnings. The Crying of Lot 49 is actually a satirical, dystopian, not too distant future story of a woman who has to be the executor of a will. This story follows Oedipa and her different dealings with her ex-husband and her friends and all the weird people who come in and out of her life. It's set in a alternate future / past of LA, and it is very biting and dark in times, and it has just so many interesting elements like a secret postal service and so many weird, interesting concepts. It's definitely a little bit difficult to read in that it is not like anything I've really read before. It's told in a very strange, dreamlike, fever dream kind of way, but I loved this book. I thought it was so interesting, and this is one that I would definitely like to reread soon. This edition is only 152 pages and worth trying if you're interested in that weird alternate future LA vibe. I read Frome by Edith Wharton in 2021. This is my first Edith Wharton that I read. This is an extremely short novella. This edition is only 77 pages. This follows a young woman writer who has come to a small town, and it's a harsh and snowy landscape, which is what she wants for her writing, but it's also extremely difficult when she doesn't really know anyone. When one day she is traveling home, she meets Frome and gets to hear his tragic story. I think this book is worth not really knowing anything before you get into it, except that it kind of has that snowy New England / upstate New York America vibes, and it is dark and twisted and depressing, but such a well-written short novella. I really enjoyed Convenience Woman by Siyaka Morata. This is a story of a young woman living in Japan. She has worked at the same convenience store for almost 20 years and she really enjoys it. She loves helping customers, she loves stocking shelves, she loves making sure that everything is neat and fresh and tidy, but her friends and family really think that she needs to get a life and get a real job. I was definitely deeply connected to this because it's about the service industry and it's about someone who's happy doing something that most people consider menial and unimportant, but which is actually the backbone of our entire civilization and society. Convenience Store Woman was translated by Ginny, Tapley, Takamori, and I would definitely highly recommend this one. It might feel a little slow, but I think it's extremely well paced and easy to read, and it was just a joy to read about this woman who is happy in her life. We can't talk about novellas without talking about And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. My edition comes in at 173 pages, and this is one of the all-time classic Golden Age mysteries by the Queen of Crime herself, Agatha Christie. This book follows several people who all get letters to go to a remote island, all under different pretenses. But when they get there, they find out that someone knows all their secrets, and they've come to this island to pay for them. This is an absolute classic. Some people love it, some people hate it, but I would say it's definitely worth the read. At under 175 pages, why not give it a try? If you like mysteries, this is the mystery that many mysteries are based off of. Lucy Foley, Rachel Hawkins, and many other contemporary writers have followed Christie's footsteps and created a And Then There Were None style mystery thriller, so you should read the original. One of my very favorite books of 2021 was The Murders of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson. This is a super fast, quick, and shocking sci-fi novella. It's only 117 pages, and there are some things about this book that shook me and I think about to this very day. This book follows Molly, who grows up on a remote farm with her parents. Her parents have lots of weird rules and they put her through the paces to become a fighter. But all this weird behavior is to keep her safe, because if Molly gets injured, strange things start to happen and she needs to be able to protect herself from herself. If you like sci-fi and if you want a really different and unique sci-fi book, I would highly recommend The Murders of Molly Southbourne. This is an ongoing series. There are at least 2 others in this series. It might be a trilogy, but it might keep going, and I haven't read the other ones yet, but I hear that this is the best of the 3 and definitely works as a standalone. I read Sula by Toni Morrison as my first ever buddy read on Booktube, and it was such a great experience. It was my first Toni Morrison. She's a classic American Black female writer. It started me on the path to read many other Black American writers, and I'm so happy that it did. I can't wait to read more of Toni Morrison's work. Some of her other works are novellas as well, but mostly they're short novels. This edition of Sula comes in at 174 pages, and similar to Passing, this follows 2 friends throughout their childhood, how they came in and out of each other's lives, and the impact that race and womanhood had on their interactions and their futures. This is a really interesting novella with touches of almost magical realism. Even though it's the only Toni Morrison I've read, I think it's a great one to get started on her work, because although it has heavy subject matter, it's not as heavy as Beloved or some of her other well-known works. I've reread The Island of Dr Moreau many times, but the most recent time was in 2021 while I was on Booktube, and this is one of my all-time favorite sci-fi books and happens to be an extremely short novella. This book is only 104 pages and it follows a young man who is shipwrecked and then saved by a dubious doctor's assistant, Montgomery, and brought to a mysterious island, the Island of Dr Moreau. Our young main character is pretty creeped out by the island, and with good reasons, because Dr Moreau is doing some very strange experiments. This is a classic. There's been movies made of this. There's many books that have been based on this. Most recently, Silvia Moreno Garcia did a reimagining, retelling of this story, and it's always worth going back to the original. This is such a fast-paced, thrilling horror sci-fi novella. If any of those are your buzzwords, you should definitely check this one out. Another buddy read that I did in my time in Booktube was A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. I really enjoyed this book about a young man returning from World War I and finding that he had kind of lost his place in life during the war. He couldn't go back to his wife and his life at the time, so instead he becomes a restorer of paintings and goes to work for a month in the country at a small church where he can restore one of their murals. This is a very small, quiet, slice of life story. It's written in 1980 but taking place between the two world wars. I highly recommend this one as a quiet but compelling short read, and I really love the time period between the two world wars. It's so interesting to see the way the world had changed and how soldiers have to cope with coming home after they've experienced the terrors of war. And this is an interesting story about a small town with its ins and outs, its secrets, its dramas, and collection of strange townspeople. Moving on to books that I have read this year, one of the most recent novellas that I have read is Yoko Ogawa's Revenge. This is a novella told in a collection of short stories, and all the short stories are interconnected. And I find that you could read these short stories separately, but really this only works to its greatest extent by being read as a whole. The Revenge follows many different people in one small Japanese town and just the little glimpses of their lives and how their lives are all interconnected. Revenge was translated by Stephen Snyder, and if you like Japanese literature, if you like creepy and unsettling tales, this is a must-read. The first Shirley Jackson book I ever read was We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It is very creepy, very unsettling. It's a story about two young women living in an old mansion that was their family's house, but not too many years ago their entire family was killed. The townspeople treat these two sisters as social pariahs and make their lives difficult. So our two sisters mostly stay in their house. This is a creepy psychological horror about how society can ostracize people and the lengths that they will go to destroy otherness. I loved this book. It took me a long time to read it, but once I did, I felt that this book was just made for me. There's so many interesting aspects of the two sisters' lives and how they cope with the oppressive feeling of the town around them and how they seek refuge. Shirley Jackson definitely is a modern classic horror writer, and I would highly suggest reading this one if you're interested in her work. This edition comes in at 146 pages, so super quick, super creepy, well worth the read. I read To Each His Own by Leonardo Scazia earlier this year. It is extremely short, coming in at 158 pages. It was translated by Adrian Folk. It follows a Sicilian town and a teacher in that town when they all find out that two prominent figures in the town have been killed, and it's more than just the hunting accident that it appears. Our main character, the teacher, becomes obsessed with finding the truth because one of the men who was killed was his friend, and he knows that this wasn't just an accident, it was murder. This is a really interesting book written in the 60s and has a lot to do with the Sicilian politics of the time, the machinations of the greater political movements, and how they manifest in this small town. I would consider this a crime novel, and if you're interested in reading crime novels that are translated works or works from other country, I would put this high on your list. Another really interesting NYRB book that I read earlier this year was Seasons of Migration to the North by Taib Salih, and this is another translated work. It was translated by Dennis Johnson Davies. It was written in 1969, and it follows a young man who travels away from his small town in Sudan to study in England. And when he comes back, a new person has moved into this small, tight-knit village, and our young protagonist becomes obsessed with finding out the past of this man, why he came to this small village, what was going on in his past that no one seems to know about, and how did he embroil himself in this small community in just a few years while the protagonist was away at school. This story has family secrets and, again, the idea of social norms and society either accepting or not accepting people for their pasts, their secrets, their dramas, or for the way they live their lives. I thought this was a really interesting book set in a place that I've never read a book from before, which is Sudan, and it was just another great way to get into modern classics that are not American or English. I feel like I have to talk about Something Is Always Happening Somewhere by Kelly McClure. This is a very short horror novella that has scarred me for life. It is so scary. It involves many, many horrific things: animal violence, SA, home invasion, suicidal tendencies, suicidal ideation, police brutality, so many scary topics. But this novella was so interesting. The main character of this book, Dale Travers, returns to her new home, which she recently bought with her wife Gina, to the worst possible scenario you can imagine. This follows her life and the time after her wife Gina dies after a horrific assault. It's a very small, quiet book in many ways, except for the gruesome, graphic, terrible, nightmare-inducing horror. It's a very small book, a quiet book, because it's just about Dale's life after this horrific event and the things that happened to her. And it's so much about grief and how grief looks differently to every person and how society really punishes people who they don't think are grieving correctly. This is just a dark, depressing, bleak book. There's no happiness in this book in any way, shape, or form. But I found that to be such an interesting thing to read. Extremely difficult to get through, worth it because I've been thinking about it ever since, and the look that it took on grief and grieving and how tragedy affects people was just really fascinating. Another horror book that I read this year was Disquiet by Julia Lee. She is an Australian author, and this was a small book that I found in a book sale, but I really, really enjoyed it. It's very short at 119 pages, and it follows a young woman who returns from Australia to Europe with her children to escape her abusive husband. This story follows the main character as she returns to a home that doesn't really want her, and at the same time her brother is returning home with his bride after they've suffered a stillbirth. This is a very short, quick, simple novel told in pretty short vignettes about the main character, her relationship to her mother, her brother, and the consequences of them all coming back to their childhood home. I really liked the eerie gothic atmosphere of this book and some of the weird, creepy moments in it. It was quiet but very quick and fun to read. And then finally, I'm going to talk about Franny, the Queen of Provincetown by John Preston. This is one of my all-time favorite gay books. I love Franny and I love this story. I read this once in November of 2021 and then I read it again in June this year. I definitely see this as a book that I could read every year. It follows Franny in her journey, how different people come in and out of her life, and how she, after her time as a drag queen in New York, finally settles into Provincetown and really makes a life for herself there and makes a huge impact on the community that comes to Provincetown in the summer and the people that live there all year long. This has a lot of sad and tragic moments. Some of Franny's life is very difficult and she loses many people in her life, but the impact that she makes, especially on young gay men in Provincetown, but also on her friends and the people who she comes to know as family, is just so uplifting and heartwarming and sweet and wonderful, and I just love this one, especially reading some very unhappy gay books. This is just a breath of fresh air. It doesn't deny the sad parts of being queer in America or anywhere in the world, but it does revel in the positive and happy moments as well. This book actually contains 2 short novellas, the first of which is only 82 pages, and that is Franny the Queen of Provincetown, and then the next one is an unfinished work of Preston's called Franny, Isadora, and the Angels, and it takes up where the first novella left off, but deals with the AIDS crisis and how that affects Franny and the people of Provincetown. I really love the first novella. I think that that one is the one to read out of these 2. The next novella is, like I said, unfinished. It was published posthumously after John Preston passed away, and it's very incomplete. So I highly suggest reading Franny the Queen of Provincetown whenever you get the chance. And those were 21 of my favorite novellas that you could read in November. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!